Well, welcome to the December meeting of the Fiscal and Economic Issues Discussion Group of the Northwest Suburbs Organizing for Action Group, part of Indivisible. And we talk about economics, budgets, and we answer your questions. Please interrupt me at any time. Ask questions and we'll pause and clarify. The plan for tonight is to spend about an hour talking about the subjects here: the labor market, the federal budget, the economy generally, and Biden's plans, specifically Build Back Better. So if you don't know what's in Build Back Better or what the Congressional Budget Office thinks of its budgetary impact, you have come to the right place, because we're going to cover that in some depth. We will plan to spend an hour on these subjects, take a break around 8 o'clock, and then hand over to Christine, who's got a special presentation tonight on modern monetary theory, which is a very exciting topic that you're hearing about in the news these days. And I'm really looking forward to that presentation. It has been a couple of months in the making. So I'm very much looking forward to that. So the areas for tonight, we'll start with the labor market, the budget, economy, Biden's plans, and then a few tips for taking action, some slides you can share, some Twitter links you can use, and some other articles that I think are very handy for sharing to try to make the case. This is a very kind of unusual set of circumstances we're in now, where the economy is recovering. There is a very strong recovery underway, very rapid growth going on, particularly in goods, not so much in services, and it's driving some inflation. And so there's a lot of discussion about what to do about that, or if anything. And politically, of course, the Democrats are trying to spin it, saying this is very good, that the economy is booming, and the Republicans are saying, you know, inflation, inflation, inflation. And the media is kind of doing a bit of both. So we will go through and cut through some of that and explain it all in lurid detail for the next hour. Please, again, stop me if you have any questions, and happy to address those. So we'll start with the employment level, the number of jobs. It's in the economy. The scale is in millions. So there are about 149, 150 million or so people that have jobs now. You see in the news, you always see the monthly change. So it was up 210,000 versus the prior month. But when you include revisions of the past two prior months, the total number of jobs actually went up by 290,000 over what was reported, the total reported last month versus this month. We're still down about 3.9 million versus the peak, so about 2.6% below the peak level of jobs. And historically, recoveries in employment tend to take longer. The GDP comes back pretty quickly, but the jobs tend to take longer. And so we'll see different economists have different views, but it's probably, we're a year or two out from recovering back to where we were before the crisis started. The approximately February 2020 level is where we usually call the pre-crisis point, February 2020, or if you're looking at quarterly numbers, it's the fourth quarter of 2019. But that's when we say pre-crisis, what we're talking about. And this is where we are with the jobs. So this is one area where we still have some ground to cover to catch up. And as I'll talk about a little later, there are 11 million job openings, meaning if you're looking for a job, there have never been this many jobs open in the economy. So one of the mysteries out there now that economists are pondering is, why is that? And we'll talk a little bit about that as we get in. So the job creation slowed this month. 210,000 was a little bit slower than what we've been seeing during Biden's time in office. So February through November, he's averaging about 600,000 jobs a month. So this was below the average of that time period. But still, if you're over 200,000, that's normally pretty good job creation. And so we were, including revisions, up about almost 300,000 this month. These are the changes in each month. And what's been happening is these revisions have been consistently upward. So the light blue line, this is 2021 each month. The light blue line is the number of jobs added as originally reported. The dark blue line is revised. Almost every month, there's been an increase in the revision, except for one, which was March. Every other month, you hear the headline number, and then the number of jobs actually gets bumped up. And this year, it's added up to quite a bit. From February to October, and actually that should say November, apologize, it's about 800,000 jobs have been added after the initial released. So Biden's actually been doing better than what you typically hear in the news, although if you look in the footnotes, you'll always see what was the adjusted number, updating the last couple of months. Those are the headlines that you typically hit. And in July, there was actually 1 million jobs added just in that 1 month. You just didn't hear about it that way because, as originally reported, it was 900 something. So these are very large revisions from a percentage standpoint. And the October revision wasn't very much. September was a pretty good chunk. October wasn't very big. Quite a bit happening after the fact. Sadly, it would help Biden if these numbers were reported, including the adjustment as a headline item. It's not. It's usually buried a little bit in the news. It's different for men and women in terms of the recovery of employment. Men are doing a little bit better, down at 1.5% from pre-crisis, when about 2.3. The typical hypothesis there is women are often the primary caregivers. Schools are reopening, but there's often times when schools are closing or kids are forced into quarantine. It makes it harder for women who are supposed to watch over them in some cases be able to do that. And so more women are out of the workforce. That's one of the theories of why men are recovering a little bit quicker than women. You have an interesting pattern here too with education. Generally, the more educated folks, like with bachelor's degrees, are actually fully recovered and then some, about 102% of the level pre-crisis in terms of the number of jobs that are held by people that have bachelor's degrees. But as you move down the education spectrum, high school degree and some college are actually, believe it or not, the high school degree actually is doing a little better than people with some college, but still very similar numbers, around 95, 96% recovered, and then no high school diploma down at 91. So those folks that are at the lower end of the education spectrum, their recovery has not been as good as folks that have a college degree. I mean, you can also see that the percent of jobs lost were really dramatic for the no high school diploma folks. For every 100 people that were employed before the crisis, only 70 something had a job in the depths of the crisis. So almost 30% job loss, which is an amazingly huge number. You didn't see that as big, only a 5% loss with the college educated. So the recovery has been somewhat uneven, to say the least, in terms of the educational background, closer for men and women, but still a little bit different. This is just some of the actual data in some interesting statistics in here. When the government reports the job figures, they have two surveys that they do. The job survey is one. That's when they survey the employers. But they also will look at the households, and they survey households, a very large number of households. And the numbers there are pretty interesting what happened here. Whereas I mentioned earlier about 200,000 jobs added, closer to 300,000 with adjustments, look at this number here. The number of employed went up over 1 million, 1.1 million. The civilian labor force grew by almost 600,000. And then the number of people that are unemployed fell by 542,000. And the people that are not in the labor force actually fell, meaning more people came in, as you would expect. And the unemployment rate fell quite a bit. It fell from 4.6 down to 4.2. And historically, the unemployment rate, depending on how many years is in your measure, you're looking at like a 5.8% average historical unemployment rate. So 4.2 historically is low. And when Biden came into office, this is from November of 2020, toward the end of Trump's time, but Biden came in, I think it was 6.3 or 6.4, and it's fallen all the way down to 4.2. And this is a low unemployment rate. And this is the survey. So this survey that talks about the number of people that are employed, the number of people unemployed, and the unemployment rate had 1,000,001 people coming in, indicated as employed. So over time, that million and that jobs creation number, the 300, tend to level out, but you're seeing some unusual increases and decreases month to month in these numbers. So clearly, if you're a Biden fan, then the 1,000,001 is your number, and if you're not, you still have the 200,000 number, the 200 or 300,000 number to look at. And so here are the unemployment rates. You can see the trends over the past year and a half or so. The U3 rate is looking good, all the way down to 4.2. It dropped 0.4, which is a large drop. It's been fairly routine for the unemployment rate to drop this much since the crisis hit, because you were at these giant numbers up here. But a 0.4% drop is rare historically. It didn't happen very much at all. Like you can count it on one hand going back 50 years. It's only really the Great Recession. You had big increases and then the big drops. And then in this one, because the unemployment rate for a while got to 15%, you see these 0.4% drops aren't all that unusual, but still, we're getting close. And it was nice to see that big drop. The U6 rate involves, it's a wider measure of unemployment. The specific definitions included down here, but that number also fell 0.5%, 0.5, a large drop in that number too. So the unemployment rate is trending very favorably. And there's the statistic. It was 6.3 in January that I mentioned earlier when at the last month that we usually consider to be a Trump month. I see Carl has joined us.
Hi.
And hello, Carl. And Carl is guru of all things employment related. And normally he covers this section. And so I thought, Carl, depending on how you want to do this, do you want to take over and handle the
I'll take
employment
over.
and
The
budget
only
section?
comment I'd make on the decline in the unemployment rate, sometimes the decline in the unemployment rate is because the labor force shrunk. And it's not that a whole bunch more people got employed. In this case, as you pointed out, 1.1 million more people got employed, and the labor force grew by 600,000. So both of those numbers were very, very positive. By contrast, I think the labor force grew by 600,000 or so for the entire 4 years of the Trump administration.
Wow.
I mean, just to put that number in perspective, as to that's a big number and a big gain. And typically, if you see that big a gain in the labor force, you would not see the unemployment rate drop like it did. But because the number of employed people grew so much, we did have that big drop in the unemployment rate. So we'll see how things shake out in the next month, because again, data is a little weird and doesn't necessarily follow continuous trends, but should be good. Okay, so the employment to population ratio for prime working age people of 25 to 54, which generally leaves out most retirees and most students, but not all. We see that it's growing, it's trending up, but we're not yet back to where we were before the pandemic set in February of 2020. When people look at the employment to population ratio or the labor force participation rate for everybody, know that those rates have been trending down pretty much forever, because 10,000 people a day are turning 65, and most retirees in the over 65 are out of the employment and not in the labor force. And so that's why so when people talk about the overall labor force participation rate going down, yawn is my reaction.
Right.
And
it was predicted. I mean, there's this big, when you look at it, it looks like an upside down dome. And for years, demographers have been predicting that overall labor force participation would be that dome shape. And they've been remarkably accurate in that estimate. There was obviously a little bit of a movement, as you would expect, from the Great Recession, and probably this one as well. But the trend has been that dome shape. It peaked when the boomers, hit their prime working years, and then it's been coming down as the country ages.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Carl.
If you look at the labor force participation rate for men, it's actually been coming down since the late 40s.
Wow. Yeah.
So not a new trend. Okay. So
women have rescued it. Yeah, that's right.
Well, again, when we weren't letting women do most jobs, they weren't active participants in the labor force. But with the Civil Rights Act of 64 and various sociological trends, women's labor force participation went from 30% up to 60% as of about year 2000. And it's been trending down since 2000, just like the men's have been trending down since forever. The budget.
Yeah, I covered earlier, Carl, that we're doing the 1 hour abbreviated version tonight. So that's why we got through the labor market stuff so fast.
That's fair. I did have one question for the group. What are you hearing your Republican friends talk about with what's wrong with the economy? Inflation being one, but anything else that they're complaining about from a fiscal or economic standpoint?
Well, the people in Illinois that I know, I always know they're Republican because all they talk about is taxes.
Okay.
That's for our state, though. I don't know if they do that in other places. I always know because that's the major issue everybody says here is taxes.
Right. We have the highest, one of the highest property tax rates in the country. And as we know that obviously property taxes don't finance the federal government. They don't finance the state government. They finance local governments, primarily schools. And most of those local governments aren't democratic. I suspect that that's true of your friends downstate.
No, I don't talk, but I did read amazingly, and I tell people this, and they always look at me because they only focus on a couple things. I read articles and I saw our state listed for all taxes that we were really only in the middle for all our taxes.
True.
And people just don't want to hear that.
Well,
I don't know if it's true or not, but that's what I've seen. So anyways.
I'll see whether I can't dig some of that out for next month. Anyhow, let's move on to, and maybe we'll even get some state senators or representatives in to talk about those issues. Okay, the deficit forecast. We just finished fiscal year 2021. So it actually ended up, it had been forecast in July at 3 trillion. It came in a little bit under that at 2.8. And the first Biden budget year, again, fiscal years October 1st to September 30th. So fiscal year 2021 started 4 years before President Trump left office. It was his last budget year. Biden's first budget year is forecast to have a $1.2 trillion deficit, which by historical standards is still fairly large, but less than half of what we've seen in the last 2 Trump years. I suspect that with the infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better, that it will come in a little bit higher than that, but we won't know until next October as to where it actually ends up, since most of the new spending is paid for. And then we see that the forecast budget deficit in fiscal year 2023, 2024, and it looks like 2025 are a little bit under $1 trillion a year before this starts going back up. And again, the long-term trend on budget deficits is spending on retirees, Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid for retirees, which is long-term care. Okay, next, and we'll try to keep going faster. Fiscal speed bumps. We took care of some things in the last week. Yay, yay, yay. Appropriations have been kicked out till I think sometime in February. And the debt ceiling, there's an agreement that it's going to get raised, and we'll see where it ends up. But so it doesn't look like we're going to get a government shutdown on either appropriations or the debt ceiling. Economy, we talked about the fact that GDP tends to recover fairly quickly, and it has. By the second quarter of this year, it was above the pre-pandemic level. Just for historical perspective, obviously the Great Recession was from December 2007 to June 2009. We had recovered from a GDP standpoint by 2011, fairly early in 2011, as I recall. But we didn't recover jobs until 2014. So we didn't get to above the pre-recession level for jobs until 2014. So what we're seeing right now with GDP recovering faster than jobs is not unusual. And we'll see what happens with GDP growth. We should have, well, fourth quarter, we will see something in January. And as David's graphic shows here, the middle line, the total, we're up about 1.4% versus the fourth quarter of 2019. We're much higher in terms of goods. We have not fully recovered in terms of services because people are still a little bit skittish, I am anyhow, about going into indoor restaurants or especially indoor movie theaters and other services, things like that. So that's why we're seeing services have not fully recovered, goods have recovered, and the demand for goods has put a strain on the logistics system of getting those goods from wherever they're manufactured to your stores or to your front porch, where the porch pirates can steal them.
Yeah, I was surprised by that statistic that Americans purchased 18% more physical goods in September 21 than they did in February 2020. And even though the supply chain is cranking through product at a record level, the ports are processing as much as they ever have. They just can't keep up with this very easily. And so when you hear that the supply chain's broken, yada, yada, the supply chain is actually producing more than it ever has and shipping more than it ever has. The problem is there's so much in the pipeline that it's clogged up still. There's still record throughput, but they just can't keep up with this. I mean, if you think about the economy growing at 2 or 3% a year before this crisis, 18% in, let's call it, almost 2 years is like 9 years of growth, or 6 to 9 years of growth in 2 years. That's the amount of volume that's being jammed through here. And that's part of why we've got inflation, because people want those goods, and businesses know that they can raise the prices, and that is indeed what is happening with some of this. So back to you, Carl, sorry.
Okay. So we're seeing here a forecast for GDP growth and inflation growth. This is a fairly new one, and I think it's a little bit more pessimistic on inflation than the Fed is. But what we see here looks like they're suggesting we're going to have really very high growth in the fourth quarter on real GDP of 8%. And then in the 3.5% level for next year, which is good. Overall for this year, 5.7%. Overall for next year, 4.4%, which is kind of tough to compared to those numbers that are in the threes all throughout 2022. But hey, this is Wells Fargo, not us, so we're using their numbers. Consumer price index, we're up at the 6.7, most recently reported 6.8% for November. This is suggesting it's going to go up in the first quarter before coming down as we go through, and that we will get down towards 3.5% by the end of the year and 2% in 2023. Again, this is a more pessimistic forecast than I'm used to seeing, and we'll see what happens. When we get to inflation, I think unless this is where we're talking about inflation, what have seen, crude oil prices have dropped from $85 a barrel on West Texas crude to, I think, about $72 a barrel the last I checked. And that's starting to show up in gas prices at the pump. And on the food front, before Thanksgiving, I couldn't find, ham, spiral sliced ham was $1.50 to $2 a pound at the low end. And it's at 85 cents a pound this week at Aldi. So if that was indicative of all food prices, I'd say that we might see a big cutback in inflation rates in the next few months. Interest rates creeping up, forecast to creep up next year. If you haven't refinanced your mortgage, you should sooner rather than later because it's expected to go up. Although even at the end of the year, a 3.7% mortgage is low by historical standards. And this is somebody else's forecast. The unemployment rate. What was the date on this forecast? I'm curious.
Yeah, this is the November 15th forecast from the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. And they show you the GDP, the unemployment rate, and the job creation. They're showing different time periods this year and next year, but then they're showing the new forecast versus the previous forecast to see what's happening. And so you've got really strong growth, but it's been revised downward, but still very strong. Yeah. The unemployment rate falling faster than they had originally anticipated because that, like this last month, that big drop, people are surprised that they don't expect with job creation in the 200 to 300 that you'd see that big a drop in the unemployment rate, but they are. And then the job creation, they expect to slow down a little bit versus what they had before. They expected a little bit faster in the jobs numbers. So it's just, this gives you a sense of what the Fed survey of professional forecasters, I forget how many forecasters they look at, but it's a large number. It's like 30 or 40, and they're looking at big brokerage houses, not Raymond James so much, but like Goldman Sachs, the large banks, and how they forecast the economy, and they get a survey of it, and you can kind of see the central tendency of some of these. But these are it's very strong growth, low unemployment rate, and respectable job creation. I mean, this, other than inflation, the economy looks really, really solid in terms of these numbers. Yeah.
Oh, the only reason I asked about the timing on this was because obviously it apparently came in before the November employment report because the unemployment rate is already at 4.2, which is lower than they're forecasting for even the first quarter of next year. And I don't see anything that's going to reverse the downward trend. But we'll see. I mean, it could go up a tenth or something like that, but I wouldn't expect it to go up very much. Okay. All items inflation. Big thing is energy, which is gasoline, but also natural gas and heating oil. And again, on the energy side, starting to see those prices come down, but not in the data that was reported for November. Likewise, used car prices started to come down, but it's not in the data that's been reported so far. So we'll see what happens going forward. I'm more optimistic about a lower inflation rate than a lot of these forecasts. But I'll probably be wrong. They'll probably be right. And again, big thing is gasoline. I don't see gasoline going up at anywhere near that rate over the next year. And I honestly think it's going to stay about the same or come down over the next year, but we'll see on that front. And if
go ahead.
I was going to say, if we ever get the chips for new vehicles, the new and used vehicle costs are going to start coming down. But that may be the end of next year or the beginning of the following year. And it looks like Anthony Stuckey has his hand raised, if I'm seeing this correctly. So did you have a question you wanted to shout out?
Yeah, there's going to be a very interesting replacement effect in new vehicles on inflation because of the chip shortage. There was quite a bit of press about how all of the Ford and GM and everybody were making their most expensive models. And so the question becomes, how much of their cheaper models do they then start producing? And you should see a dramatic drop in new car prices because the mix has changed, right?
Oh, wow. That's a great point. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that may well be true. So if that happens and the mix changes and we go back to getting, buying because the less expensive cars that are available, that could change again the inflation. Although I don't know exactly how the Fed or the Bureau of Labor Statistics does inflation for the different types of cars, because I think they're supposed to take into account the mix already, so that it's to the extent it's all big expensive SUVs. They compare it to what those big expensive SUVs were a year or two earlier. They don't compare it to what the Ford Focus was, is my understanding.
Yeah, I'm curious about that. We'll have to look into the mix, how they handle that mix issue, because that's a really good question. I don't know. So we'll take a look at it. I wrote it down as I think you'll see when you look at this. Like for example, gasoline fell about 20-ish% from November to November 2019 to 2020. So when you see gasoline is up 58%, it was up off a much lower base. I mean, we had deflation in gasoline in 2020, in other words, because of the crisis. So the 1-year comparison isn't always the best, and this is why we did a 2-year comparison. Numbers are a lot less scary when you look at these numbers. This is 2-year average annual increase. So we're comparing the prices versus 2 years ago, November 2019, and dividing by 2 essentially. And you kind of see the numbers are a lot less scary. 4% all item inflation, 3.3% all items less food and energy. Annual average rate, not much inflation at all in 2020, and a lot of inflation in 2021, almost like we're getting 2 years plus worth crammed in here. And it's mostly goods, not so much in services.
Yeah, the outliers, as we can see in this chart, are those used vehicles and gasoline.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Wages are up since pre-pandemic. They're actually up a little faster than inflation.
And there was an interesting debate back and forth between Paul Krugman and one of the economists that worked for Obama. I'm forgetting his name right now. He's a Harvard economist. And he says real wages have actually gone down. Real wages have actually gone down, meaning wages haven't grown as fast as inflation. In other words, in his calculation, these lines don't, the blue line is below the red line, at least recently. And the way he explained it is there are 5 million lower income workers that have yet to return to the workforce, and it's distorting these official statistics, which are based on averages. Kind of like that idea of the mix issue. We have a mix issue here where the Harvard economist felt that it was distorted. He said that real wages are probably down a little bit, 1 or 2% down, whereas we're saying if you take 10.2 minus 7.7, what is that? 2.2 math on the fly. 2.5%. Thank you, Carl. He's saying that we're saying real wages are up 2.5%. He's saying real wages are down 1.9. The difference is that you take out those lower end workers, and that's how he's doing the math. So he and Krugman got into it. I like to brag when people use our charts, and it looked like Krugman used almost this exact chart on his page. So I was very proud because we've been sharing this chart for a couple months. So every now and then I hope that famous people either think like we do or they steal our charts, but you never know.
Well,
But-
the mix issue, I think, is a factor that overstates this somewhat, whether that it totally eliminates this wage gain versus inflation or not is, I don't have enough data to calculate that.
Right. That's not easy data to get. That's why when a Harvard economist that used to work for Obama says, these numbers look a little rosy, I'm inclined to believe them. But at least this is what the official stats that are easy to get say.
Okay. Stock market, it's Wall Street, not Main Street. Most people don't care a whole lot, but some people do. And to the extent that it was what Trump bragged about to a great extent was, records in the stock market. What the heck? We can brag about it with regard to Biden. Although it's like a lot of things, I'm not sure how much Biden really, Biden's policies really affect the stock market in the near term.
But it's a good bragging point. We'll take it. Up 39% since the election. That's a pretty nice statistic. And he set the record for the first year in office measured from election date at 37.4. And the top 5 here are all Democrats. So you got to go all the way to Bush in '88 to get to a Republican.
Yeah, I go with, the first person to argue that you should measure it from election day as opposed to when somebody actually took office and started instituting policies was Trump. Using from election day is really suspect in my. But hey, if we're going to argue a nonsense,
fair game.
Let's
turnabout is fair play.
That Trump used. Okay.
Yep.
All right.
Yeah, let me do this one.
Sure.
One of the things I was trying to do here was say what's going well, what's kind of meh, and what's bad. And so the media is often over here about inflation and not really talking about what's over here, green, low unemployment, 11 million job openings, robust job creation or job recovery pace. Goods are up, as we talked about earlier, tremendously, which is really why we have the inflation. Stock market's booming, which means we've got record household net worth in the country. We're the richest we've ever been in terms of our real, meaning inflation-adjusted net worth, we're the richest. The consumers are in very good shape because they've saved a lot over the past couple of years from all these relief programs. The vaccinations are out there if you want them. Democrats are about 90% plus vaccinated, whereas Republicans are closer to 60. And the economic forecasts, as we talked about, are very positive. So, if you're fighting with people on the internet, you can just cut and paste this picture and drop it right in there and be like, hey, Biden's kicking butt. Stuff over here that aren't so good. We talked about the jobs aren't quite back to where we were before the crisis. The jobs recovery is uneven. Those lower educated folks are struggling. What else is interesting in here? The ports, even though the ports are processing record volumes, they still can't keep up with the goods demand. And as Carl mentioned, the budget deficit is expected to be cut in half. Now, we're going to hear from an MMT perspective why cutting the budget deficit isn't so good, because it slows your growth, your economic growth. But the budget deficit is going to get cut in half next year, really, whether Biden passes Build Back Better or not, because it just doesn't change the deficit that much, nor does the infrastructure bill. Their CBO has scored them as not adding that much to the deficit. So for reasons we'll get into, we'll talk about Build Back Better here in a minute. So when you're fighting with people, I think this, as busy as this slide is, you have all the talking points you could ask for, whether you want to argue pro or con. You want to see where the con's coming from over here on the right, or maybe in the middle, and then you've got the pro over here on the left in terms of the economy being in really, really good shape.
Yeah, not the economy directly, but obviously with the Delta and Omicron variants, we have not made nearly the progress on the virus that we'd hoped for this year in terms of shutting down new cases.
Yeah, and some very stubborn people over here. We're Democrats at 90, Republicans at 60 approximately. That data is about a couple months old, but still, we could do better on that.
Yeah.
All right. Any questions on the economic variables before we do a quick one on the Build Back Better? We want to go for about 10 more minutes, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll go over to Christine to talk about MMT.
I'm seeing different numbers, at least on some sources, in the vaccination percentage. I don't know whether they're trustable or not, but some group called usafacts.org says that 71% of Americans have had their first vaccination and 60% are fully vaccinated. They're using the 2-dose for Pfizer and Moderna definition for fully, I believe.
Yeah. Well, again, I don't think David reported an overall vaccination percentage. He reported a vaccination percentage for Democrats and a separate one for Republicans.
Yeah, I guess that would imply, though, that the independents are not vaccinated hardly at all if we're going to somehow mix those three groups together and end up with numbers like these.
Yeah, you're right. It seems like it would be based on the 90 and the 60 that it would be a little higher.
Yeah. Maybe this is old data. I looked it up recently and I thought it was as of early December at least, but.
Well, the other thing, David, do you know whether the data you reported for 90% of Democrats being vaccinated, is that a fully vaccinated or have received at least one shot?
No, that's first dose, and it was the statistics were as of the end of September.
Okay, so that's first dose. So you got a 90 and a 60 for first dose to compare to that 71%.
Fully.
Yeah, that might work. If you're only talking first dose, 71, yeah, that could possibly work. The 60 fully vaccinated though wouldn't. So
yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, that could work.
Let me clarify that too. I can always put a little tiny footnote on it or change the wording a little bit. And
well, I would have preferred a U.S. government source for the data, but CDC or NIH or.
Right. Yeah. The one I had, I think, was the Pew Center, if I remember right. And I'll take a look. They usually are very dependable. So.
Well, my source wasn't. I mean, it may be derived from U.S. government, but it's not a primary source.
Right.
The CDC is about as good as you're going to get. I like that idea.
CDC data, that's the best, but we have a problem with the timeliness of a lot of the government reporting.
And the CDC isn't going to give you Democrat versus Republican. They're just going to give the overall. They're not going to do a partisan split.
Yeah. Pew Research would probably do that. Yeah, you need a polling group.
Yeah, they did a nice job with it. All right, let's talk Build Back Better. With the short time we have here, this is all based on, almost everything I'm going to share with you is based on the two things that are in the lower left. That New York Times article is great. So if you want more detail, what I've done is I've cut and pasted a lot of the tables and graphics out of there and here, and then layered in some of the CBO stats. So let's just get the CBO piece out of the way. CBO said, when you add in all the spending and then also the tax hikes on corporations and higher income individuals, $367 billion over a decade, but they said we're not scoring investments in the IRS enforcement, which they thought even the CBO scored as they said it's not scored, but it's $207 billion if you scored it. Don't ask me why they did it that way, but for whatever reason, maybe it has to do with the rules. There are certain laws that they follow and rules that they follow. But if you take the 367 and you take away the 207, you get about 160 billion over a decade total, 16 billion a year, which is like a rounding error in the federal budget. In other words, this thing is paid for substantially based on the Congressional Budget Office data. Whether you use even if you use 367, 37 billion a year is still a minor amount when you think, for example, we spend 600 and 700 billion a year on defense. So it's just not a large deficit impact because it's mostly paid for. So the blue over here is how it's paid for, where the money's coming from. And over here is who's benefiting in large categories. And I'll go into the detail on some of the categories. Key point is, if the deficit is what's scaring you about Build Back Better, it shouldn't because it's paid for. And most of the taxes, I'll show you the distribution, like who's impacted by the taxes and who benefits. very much focused on taxes hit the rich and the benefits hit the middle class. So we'll go into that here in a little bit. I'm not going to read all these off. I wanted you to have them for reference, but the kinds of stuff that's in here, how much it is over 10 years, and then because a lot of these have different durations, they're not all 10-year programs. The Democrats did this to kind of keep the cost down in some cases, probably in most cases. So you'll see this duration. And also some of them don't start immediately. So there's a little bit of detail on that, but childcare, children up to 5, capping the expenses for childcare at a certain percentage of income. So paying a subsidy essentially for people to get childcare. Paid leave, extending that child tax credit. If you've got kids and you're getting a check for $250 or $300 a month, Democrats want to extend that for a year. Universal preschool. And then some other tax benefits and some smaller items down here in that one. Again, these are all coming from this article, which I recommend if you can get it. To get through the paywall, read it. Otherwise, you're going to get the highlights here. Climate and environment, renewable tax credits, a lot of different things to encourage people and businesses to reduce their carbon emissions. Clean water and energy, trying to get clean water for people, getting rid of lead pipes, retrofitting buildings, that sort of thing. Healthcare. If you have an elderly relative who's on Medicaid, my understanding of Medicaid is you typically have to be in an institution or it's pretty hard to get the money at home. They're going to dramatically increase the amount of money that's available to care for people at home, which is where a lot of people would prefer it if they could. Expanding the Affordable Care
Medicaid
Act.
gap line.
Go ahead.
That's mainly for the states that did not expand Medicaid. So it's not for the older folks and the long-term care. That's the Medicaid gap are the people, the low-income people in Florida and Texas primarily that don't make enough money to qualify for premium subsidies in the exchanges because you had to make at least the poverty level wages and income to qualify for premium subsidies.
So you're saying the people that needed the premium subsidies the most weren't eligible?
Right. That
boy.
that was the effect of the Supreme Court saying that we could not require expanded Medicaid in every state. And so a lot of states went ahead and did not enact it, and they have large numbers of uninsured people because of that.
And David mentioned lead pipes. It was, once I realized what was going on, that was sort of an annoyance for me to discover that in Chicago, that poor families, typically minority, are getting their water for their kids out through lead pipes, and that I don't forget what the if the family could afford to and wanted to pay somebody to replace it, as I recall, the permitting fee was like $5,000 or $4,000 or something outrageous for a while. Besides whatever it would cost to replace the pipes.
Well, you've got lead coming from two different things in Chicago. You've got the delivery system, which is the city's pipes, to bring it to your front door, and then you've got lead coming, potentially leaching off the pipes within the building.
Which of these is going to be fixed by Build Back Better? Either or neither or both?
My guess is the only thing that the federal government is going to do is provide money to the cities to deal with getting the pipes to the building, getting clean water to the building.
Chicago actually has some of the worst of that in the country. My cousin's house in a very nice neighborhood in Forest Glen had a lead service up to about 2 feet above the basement floor.
Wow.
Yeah. And
all right.
And yeah, it's not just poor neighborhoods, because again, a lot of the better neighborhoods are 100, 150 years old and have those kind of pipes.
Wow.
The interesting thing about that house was as soon as the lead stopped, my uncle had covered the pipes with asbestos.
Oh, okay.
Well, hey,
even
it
better.
was good. It was a good insulator.
Wow. So, all right. So we're almost, let me just zip through a couple of these. The presentation's available to everyone on this call. Hopefully you all have a copy of, have the link to get to it. But there's housing. There's also some big education amounts, immigration amounts, which I'm sure will be extremely controversial. I'm curious to see if that makes it through the Senate. Deportation protection. And then here's how it's funded. Mainly large, this interesting idea of a corporate minimum tax, meaning normally corporations keep books for tax purposes, books for accounting and profit purposes. If they're going to have an alternate minimum tax applied against that, not the tax books, but against their actual accounting earnings that they report to Wall Street. Their true profit according to what are called generally accepted accounting principles. And that's expected to bring in a chunk of money. This is that idea of these corporations that are very profitable but don't pay taxes. They're going to change that computation so that they do. And there's also some individual tax items mainly directed at the wealthy. And the one that's the Democrats have gotten in a little bit of trouble over is this whole SALT idea, which is a little more complicated than we want to talk about here right now. But there's lots of stuff you can find on the SALT debate going back and forth. It kind of goes the other way of it's a sort of a tax break for people that are generally more well off because they have more expensive houses. The distributional effect of Build Back Better is very favorable, very progressive change. This is the percent change in after-tax income based on the quintile of income. So 20th percentile, the bottom 20, second 20, et cetera. So a 4% change in after-tax income for the lowest quintile. And then for the top 0.1%, very rich people, actually a 6% decline in after-tax income because of the taxes. You'll notice the benefits go all the way up to the 80th percentile or so, small hit for the top 20% on average, and a big hit in that top 1% group. So it's very much a progressive type structure. There's a comparison here to the Trump tax cuts, which go the other way. It would be the mirror image of what we just showed you. And then there are a few slides back here that different organizations have shared. You can share these easily enough online. This is infrastructure, where the infrastructure is being spent. These are some slides that Biden's starting to share on the economy. His the WhiteHouse.gov or his Twitter account, you'll find some of these comparisons of where things were when Biden showed up versus where they are now. This is one here. Here's another that's a little more recent through November. Has the latest unemployment rate here, so you know that's the latest month. And there's that 71% statistic that Paul mentioned. People employed, retail sales. They're just using different metrics trying to see what sticks. And the progress on the unemployment. The initial unemployment insurance claims hit a 50-year low this past week. So that's another positive, and they had a nice slide here to emphasize that. You have some links here that you can look at. I did a thread on the Biden boom, which you can find by just on the presentation, just control-click or cut and paste that into a browser, and you have a bunch of slides like the ones we shared in this presentation that you can share with people. Some or all of them, and you have some other stuff in here about how Democrats are better for the economy generally and some other subjects. So I think that concludes our presentation.
One last comment from my end, David.
Yeah, go for it.
Jennifer Rubin within this past week, wrote a column about what to say about Build Back Better. And I put a quote from that column in the chat along with the link to the column. But her basically says is, if Biden is to have any chance of reaching average voters, he must refrain from reciting the interminable list of benefits in the Build Back Better bill. Instead, the message should be succinct. Build Back Better will reduce housing, drug, healthcare, and child care costs, and Republicans are against it.
Sounds good to me.
That's her simplification of the message. Okay.
Yeah, one of the things I like to do and it's not, we didn't do much of it here, but one of the things that comes in handy when you're doing economic statistics is how much help did a typical house, home get. Like the $1,400 check is something very tangible to people, and the $250 to $300 a month checks are very tangible. It's trying to make these economic statistics meaningful for people from a dollar impact And so I would take Jennifer Rubin's thing and I'll look at it and see if we can put something like that into a slide that says, you know, the typical household's going to get X dollar benefit for housing and X benefit for medical. You know, try to make it a real pocketbook thing, make it as simple as checks. And that's not always easy to do with policies. It's not.
Sure.
And so we need help from our think tank friends to get on the ball and do some of that.